The topic is recent value chain disruptions, but I'm really going to be talking about this in the context of an economic assessment that we did for the Canadian Roundtable of Sustainable Beef that was published last October. And the Canadian Roundtable did a complete sustainability assessment looking at the three pillars of environment, social, and economic. And we wanted to create a framework for the economic discussion and how did it really connect back to the environmental and the social aspects of sustainability. And with that in mind, we worked off of the definition that economic sustainability is the ability of a system to maintain productivity in the face of a major disturbance, as well as shifts in consumer preferences. And these major disturbances we tend to think of as border closures, major market disruptions, disease outbreaks. But there are also disruptions and disturbances within the flow of the supply chain. And so the recent tuberculosis case in Western Canada shows how the thought may be that within a supply chain you can do a quarantine and those animals should be able to stay there for 2 to 3 months while testing occurs, and that shouldn't be a problem, except for the fact that a lot of those farms were cow-calf operations and they were quarantined 2 weeks before they were going to wean and sell their calves. They didn't have the feed, number one, to feed those calves, and number two, they didn't have the infrastructure set up and designed to handle those animals over the winter months. And so it created a major disruption on those operations of how we were going to deal with this over the time it took for CFIA to do the testing. And it's one where if you don't deal with it, you end up having other implications of what are the animal welfare implications if you don't have the infrastructure available for those animals. And how do you then, the uncertainty and the economic uncertainty for an operation of making the investment to have those things available and feeding when at the end of the 3 months you may be told that those animals are going to be destroyed. And you're not necessarily going to have that quarantine lifted and be able to sell those animals at market value. And so even if the best case scenario turns out and you are able to sell them 3 months down the road at market value, what has been the implications for that producer of the fact that he wasn't able to pay his bills when he had thought he was going to be able to, and will that market value also cover the additional costs that he incurred? The other is that this definition used to say, a couple months ago, slow shifts in consumer preferences. And the idea is that consumer preferences evolve over time and are slow changes that occur. But these are now happening at a more rapid pace. And it's not just quick shifts happening towards new technologies, but also shifts towards old technologies that have been around for 30, 40, or 50 years. And there's a real uncertainty then that producers face of how confident can they be in adopting new technology if the consumer is going to reject it. So one of the premises underlying economic sustainability is the fact that commodities tend to experience declining terms of trade. And you have the situation where supplies tend to increase faster than demand over time, resulting in lower deflated prices for producers. And so there's two ways to address this. Number one, you increase your demand. And if your domestic market is completely saturated, your option is to go international and ensure that you have the market access and reliable market access to take advantage of that global demand. But number two is what's in control by the producer, and that's to continue to focus on decreasing their per unit cost of production. And research by the Western Beef Development Center has shown that the top 25% of producers in Saskatchewan have break-even cost of production, 20% lower than the other 75% of producers. So there's definitely opportunities out there for producers to be improving on their cost of production. The irony is that part of the cause for declining terms of trade is also part of the cure. So the framework that we set up was to have long-term producer viability. You have to have profitability, and you have to be monitoring your long-term cost of production in order to stay ahead of that curve of declining terms of trade. But you also have to ensure that you have consumer resilience, both in your domestic and international demand, and that you're responding to these shifting preferences and are able to communicate that back through the supply chain so that producers can respond to it. In terms of producer profitability and viability, we had a couple of challenges. And first is the fact that we have a very distinct cattle cycle within Canada. And this means that over a 10 to 12-year period, you're going to have 40 to 50% of those years where you're actually not profitable. And this is due to the biology of the cow and how we respond to those market signals to either expand or contract the herd. So we don't necessarily expect a producer to be profitable every single year. So we're looking at long-term averages, not the annual. The other is the dynamics in the supply chain and the fact that it's frequent within the beef industry that you don't have everyone, in fact, it's very rare to have everyone profitable at the same time. And this is because when a cow-calf producer is profitable and they're selling that calf at a high price, that means that the input cost for the feedlot is very high and it's squeezing their margins. So we need to take that into account as well. But all of the sectors are characterized by small margins, and competition means that they're typically driving towards zero economic profits, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's zero financial profit within the industry. So in Australia, they did a Northern Beef report in 2013, and they came up with these 8 criteria for economic sustainability. And they noted that they're fairly hard-nosed and that most entrants within the business are not necessarily going to meet all 8 of these. But their big concern was that any agricultural sector that relies on land has the ability to actually be unsustainable for long periods of time by living on equity. And that's what we don't want to do. If we're going to be sustainable, we don't want to be eroding our equity over time. In our analysis, we found that only operations with over 800 head actually met all 8 of these criteria. And it didn't mean that smaller operations were unsustainable necessarily, but it may mean that they had a smaller reliance on beef as part of their operation and they had other income sources. So our economic viability showed that we had short and medium-term costs being covered by our cow-calf producers, and 3 out of 4 of our typical farms were also covering long-term costs in 2013, right before the run-up in prices. But we know that over the last 15, 16 years, the beef industry has been very resilient in continuing to produce a product, even in the face of major disturbances like BSE, border closures, and other marketing challenges that have been faced. And they can do that by drawing on cash reserves, off-farm income, or even alternative income sources, or even drawing down equity. And it's one thing to be drawing on those on a short-term basis over a cattle cycle, but if you're drawing on them on a continual basis, it would be an indication that that operation is unsustainable. Now, we have lots of diversity within our industry from coast to coast with a lot of different climatic changes. And so when these producers are looking at that drive to have decreasing per unit cost to product or decreasing costs, how they go about it can be very different. If you're in a environment where you get lots of rain, say Eastern Canada here, you may have a lot of high costs because you're going to have housing costs and other things. So you may be a high cash cost producer, and therefore you may focus on productivity and being a high productivity producer in order to reduce that per unit cost of production. Conversely, if you're in the short grass of Saskatchewan, where it's a low productivity environment, you may be focusing at reducing your cash costs in order to reduce that per unit cost of production. So there's going to be various strategies used within the industry to address this. And regardless of where you're located, there are going to be times within that cattle cycle when margins are negative and producers need access to risk management tools in order to navigate those years. So over time, we have, say, an average sustainable farm where 100% of their income is coming from beef, and he's profitable. So in 1990, in order to be covering your unpaid labor on that operation, you needed 200 head. Over time, and we're not assuming that profit margins are going to be increasing incrementally over time, but let's just say they assume steady, you've got increasing costs of living. And this means that 10 years later, by 2000, you now needed 400 head, and by 2013, you needed 800 head. Now, this is one where now you don't just need to be profitable to be sustainable, but you need to be profitable to the point where you can be continually investing in expansion in order to maintain 100% of your income coming from beef. Now, if that operation stayed at 200 head in 1990, by 2000, he may still be a sustainable operation, but now only 50% of his income is coming from beef, and the other 50% is coming from something else, maybe a different commodity, and maybe off-farm income. And by 2013, only 25% of his income is coming from beef. So those are some of the dynamics that are driving consolidation within the beef industry. The other aspect is this off-farm income and the need for off-farm income. When we talk about the opportunity costs that are or are not being covered within agriculture, it tends to be a fairly heated topic about how do we define that? Are we going to measure it as say your minimum wage because it's a simply worker wage that you need to be doing, or do you value it at what that owner-operator could get on an off-farm job? How are you going to do this? But we also have to remember that even if this number is very low in terms of annual income on a herd of 200 head, of which that represents 97% of operations in Canada, we have to remember that there's other compensation within that farm. So a lot of his living expenses are also covered. He might be driving a nice truck or something else. So those are things to keep in mind as well. But for a lot of these producers, the big question for them is, are they actually protecting their equity, and do they have something to retire on? And this brings into the question of land value, because a lot of these producers are depending on appreciating land values for their retirement. But as that land is appreciating, they're also able to leverage themselves. And so the question is, when you have small margins, are those producers able to service debt in a timely manner? And is that adequate to address debt reduction if they have years of negative margins? Consequently, they're maybe drawing on those alternative income sources to be paying off that debt. But the challenge then becomes in years when you have declining land values that can create a crunch on those operations. And this would be a major disturbance, is depreciating land values like we saw in the 1980s, where you have producers that need to reduce debt quickly, but they also have a crunch in terms of raising working capital. Another challenge and disturbance that's going to be faced by agriculture over the coming years is succession. Right now, it's estimated that unfilled vacancies are costing the beef industry $141 million in sales, with a gap of 2,700 workers. But that's projected to quadruple over the next 10 years as we see retirement of older producers. And so the question becomes, where's the next generation going to come from, and do we have the business models to accommodate their success within the industry, particularly if we're looking at more models where those producers need to be renting both land as well as cattle. And for the beef operation to be sustainable over the long term, you don't just have to be profitable, but you also have to be competitive. Competitive domestically against other commodities, but also competitive internationally when we think the fact that 45% of our production is exported. But our main one is the fact that we need to have those price signals from the consumer back to the producer to ensure that we're producing more of what the consumer wants and less of what they don't want. Because if we're continuing to produce what the consumer doesn't want, we're going to end up with a smaller market share and really a declining industry as a whole. And some of the challenges for the beef industry with that have been really discerning between what is a passing fad that's not going to be here in the next 3 years, and what's a long-term trend that will be here. The beef industry is frequently considered to be slow in responding to consumer signals. And it's not necessarily that we're slow, but that a producer is sitting back and saying, okay, if I respond right now to the changing attributes that a consumer wants, and I put the additional effort in, maybe a higher cost of production, I verify it so that it can be a marketable product with that attribute, it's not going to get to the consumer for 2 to 3 years. And if the consumer has moved on to something else in those 2 to 3 years, I've now produced a product for a market that is no longer there, creating great uncertainty and risk for that producer. And so they really want to ensure that that demand is going to still be there. And maybe if it's a new technology, you don't really want to go first. Maybe you're going to let the US producer go first and see how that consumer responds to that new technology versus Canada being first. And then the question becomes is, if that's a technology that has a significant impact on competitiveness, can our Canadian producers afford to sit back and let someone else go first or not? So we've got long-term trends for consumer demand for protein, increased population, more urbanization, growing disposable incomes, and we also have short-term market impacts, whether it's prices, supplies that are encouraging switching between proteins and cuts. But it's really those medium-term perceptions right now around food safety, beef quality, whether it's certified humane, hormone-free, antibiotic-free, the list goes on, of where can we actually work? What is the market demand? How big is that market demand that we're looking to supply? In terms of domestic demand, we have some of the strongest demand since the late 1980s. And really, this is being driven by quality and brands based on quality attributes. We have a grading system within the beef industry that really breaks things down in terms of AA, AAA, and prime. But the brands who are able to really succeed in terms of providing that consistently quality product to a consumer are able to go even narrower than that. And they're talking about top 2/3 AAA. And that seems to be an area where they get the best consistency that the consumer is then coming back and they're building a brand based on that. And over the last 10 years, our AAA and prime production has increased at about 1% per year. But over the last 5, that's accelerated to be about 2% per year. We also have international demand, and this is a tremendous opportunity for Canada and other major exporting countries. But in order to take advantage of it, we need reliable market access. And so when you see an announcement out there saying we now have access, that's a wonderful thing. But what kind of access is it? Is it limited, bone-in versus boneless? Is it fresh or frozen? But also, you then have all of the opportunities to increase production targeted for that market, and then find out later that packer approvals haven't happened. So then, again, you have another supply chain disruption. So we're really looking at continuous improvement in terms of economic sustainability in 3 areas. In order to support consumer resilience, those producers are looking to have continuous improvement in quality, so not just your grading attributes, but also these other credence attributes that Jill was talking about this morning. For that producer viability, we're looking at improving productivity in order to decrease that per unit cost of production, and this has a lot of crossover with reducing your environmental impact and natural resource use. But in order to connect these two, we also need to be having continuous improvement in marketing. And so historically, cattle would have been sold on the average on a live basis. And we've really changed that over time to go to rail with grids for grading and quality, and then adding traceability for different attributes throughout the supply chain. And we need to ensure that we continue to have marketing practices that ensure that communication up and down the supply chain of what we want more of and what we want less of. And I think I'm out of time. But this is my last slide because I had been asked to speak just very briefly from an industry point of view on the livestock market interruption strategy. And I've really broken this down into sort of 3 take-homes. First is the fact that business risk management programs have a place, and they serve that place and purpose. But for a major disruption, they are insufficient. And that means that we need a disaster fund for these major disruptions. They're very costly, and they don't just need the dollars put to them, they need resources. There needs to be boots on the ground to do quarantines and testing and how we're going to handle any disease outbreak. In terms of roles and responsibilities, when these things happen, there has to be communication between industry participants and government. They both have to be at the table communicating because decisions need to be made, and those business decisions are not in the hands of the government, but they need to know what those impacts of those business decisions are going to be on their long-term viability of their operations. And then finally, marketing collaboration. If there is a multi-species outbreak of anything, we need to set aside some of those competitive aspects where beef and pork are competing in the marketplace so that we can come up with non-competitive marketing strategies to deal with additional production in if we have a loss of market access. So that's it.